presentation. So please feel free to enter all of your questions in the Manage Q&A chat box. Thank you for joining us this evening. You are attending the webinar entitled Teaching Chaucer. Our leader for the session is Timothy L. Stinson, Associate Professor of English, North Carolina State University, also an NHC Fellow. Timothy Stinson is Associate Professor of English and a University Faculty Scholar at North Carolina State University. He is a member of the program faculty for the Communication, Rhetoric, and Digital Media program and an affiliate faculty of the Jewish Studies program. Stinson's research has garnered numerous awards and grants, including support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Council on Information and Library Resources, and the Bibliographical Society of America, and he has held fellowships from both the NEA and the National Humanities Center. He has published in leading journals in the field of medieval studies and book history, including Speculum, a journal of medieval studies, the Chaucer Review, the Yearbook of Langland Studies, Manuscript Studies, and the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America. His work has also garnered recognition and support from North Carolina State University, where he is a University Faculty Scholar and has received a CHAS Research Award, 2 Research and Innovation Seed Funding Awards, and a Non-Laboratory Scholarship Research Award. His research interests include medieval English, poetry, codicology, history of the book, and digital humanities. Stinson is a devoted teacher and a recipient of the NC State Outstanding Teacher Award. He has helped to develop new curricula and courses in the fields of medieval English literature, history of the book, and digital humanities at NC State. He is a contributor to the MLA's approaches to teaching Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and collaborated on the creation of a history of the book teaching collection in the NC State Department of English. To our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally, and without further ado, I present to you our scholar, our friend, and our leader for this session, Tim Stinson. Tim, we're honored to have you with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Mike. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear.
All right. Well, thank you for your very generous introduction. And I also wanted to thank Raven Ferguson at the Humanities Center, who's been behind the scenes and made all this possible. She's been helping out with everything. And thanks also to all of you out there. I see actually lots of messages coming in from the west, all the way from the West Coast. So thanks to all of you who have made the time to be here. I know many of you, it's after regular working hours, so I appreciate your interest. So as Mike said, and as you no doubt know, our topic for today is teaching Chaucer. And I very much enjoy teaching that aspect of my career. And I've told many people over the years that the thing about teaching I enjoy absolutely the most is teaching Chaucer. I find that it's something for everyone, from the beginning student all the way up to not only graduate students, but really professors themselves. Every time I read Chaucer, I see something new in him. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and to share with you all some of my thoughts about and approaches to teaching Chaucer. I have here just a quick presentation roadmap on the slide that will kind of give you a sense of where we're headed. I'm going to talk to you about some background information. This will be Chaucer's life, a little bit of biography, Chaucer's world, and then the status of English as a language, which is a very important topic with Chaucer. All of those are in the category of kind of filling you in background material, but I'm going to also be making some suggestions about how that might inform our teaching along the way. So it's going to be contextual information, but with the goal of modeling for you how you might approach it in your own class, but also offering some suggestions about that. And then for the second half, we're going to turn towards actually looking at some examples, talking about whether to teach Chaucer in the original Middle English or in translation or some combination thereof. Talk very briefly about his works, overall, everything he wrote, that is, and then dig into the Canterbury Tales for the latter half, since that's the thing that almost certainly you're most likely to teach. At the end, I have some resources which you're already familiar with for the most part from the reading packet, I think, and I have a section on teaching genre that you've already read the excerpt from the MLA volume on teaching. That's sort of there. If we get to it, great. If we don't, you've already read it. I want to make sure we have plenty of time to answer your questions. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about Chaucer, the the man. And I thought I would start with what might sound to you like a somewhat obvious question, which is who is or was Chaucer? Now, I imagine all of you already know who Chaucer was, which is why you registered for this class. And of course, you can get detailed biographical information pretty easily online from many sources. So, what I'm really hoping to do here is not simply to recapitulate a set of known facts about his life or the timeline of events, but to talk about how we might frame Chaucer's biography and his literary output for our students. Now, the first and the most remarkable fact here is that we know much about Chaucer at all. And that's not because he was an unremarkable individual, of course, far from it. It's just remarkable because we know so little about most medieval English poets, or indeed even for centuries after Chaucer. We often don't know a lot biographically about writers, but in the case of medieval England, the significant majority of surviving works are by unknown authors. So it's remarkable that we know actually quite a bit about Chaucer. Now, today, his fame is a result of his literary reputation. So just a moment ago, I mentioned I was going to focus on how we might frame two things: Chaucer's biography and Chaucer's literary output. As it turns out, these are actually two very different things in a surprising way to a lot of people. There's Chaucer the poet. He's known to us as the father of English poetry, as people began calling him that in the generation following his death, and that's still a phrase you hear. There's the author of the Canterbury Tales, whom we know. This is the Chaucer we teach. This is the Chaucer we spend most of our time with in the classroom, the Chaucer we're spending time with this evening. But in fact, the historical records from his own time, which again, we're very fortunate to have, show us a very different person. There's a substantial amount surviving, over 500 documents that document his life. And they show us a very different person. They don't mention his poetry for the most part. They show this a busy civil servant who held this very wide variety of positions throughout his career. Chaucer lived during the 14th century. We're not really sure the year of his birth, sometime in the 1340s. We do know the date of his death, which was October 25th, 1400. So he's very squarely in the 14th century. And he grew up in what we might think of today as a middle class family. That's a little bit anachronistic to use that term, I think, for his time period, but that's basically accurate. His father, John, was a wine merchant, part of this growing mercantile class of late medieval London. And Chaucer first appears in the written record as a page in 1357, a page in the household of the Countess of Ulster. And this was actually quite a fortunate gig to get early on in his life, because the Countess of Ulster was the wife of Lionel, who was the third son of the king at the time, Edward III. So this puts Chaucer into an important orbit very early. It probably speaks to some connections that his family must have had to place him there. And during his career, Chaucer actively served under two kings. The first two we see here, Edward III, who reigned 1327 to 1377, and Richard II, who reigned 1377 to 1399. Henry IV was crowned in 1399, the year before Chaucer's death. So in terms of Chaucer's career in the government, he wouldn't really have interacted with him much, but it's almost certain that he knew him well before that, for reasons we'll get into in a moment. So a few highlights, just again, over 500 documents. There's way too much to cover here, but a few thoughts about mileposts that we might consider and that might be useful to thinking about in talking about Chaucer in the classroom. So He was in the military early on. In 1359, he was captured during the Hundred Years' War in a siege operation in France, and the king contributed to his ransom. We see Chaucer then going back and forth between England and France during peace negotiations in 1360. Following this, a wide variety of civil service careers. He served as a diplomat to Spain, to Flanders, to Italy, to France. And this is important because Italian and French poets provided for him literary models. He was often translating or reworking stories from these poets, but also thinking about the role of the poet in these societies and the verse forms they used. And to a large extent, what Chaucer really did was take these poets from the Romance languages, Italian and French, and, and show for the first time really that English could do the same thing. He was appointed in 1374 comptroller of the Port of London, so he's controlling these very important fees on taxation on things that are coming and going into London. He would have interacted with a vast array of different people and folks from different countries and different social statuses during this. He served as a member of Parliament, so he had quite a diverse career. And again, these are the things that the documents tell us about. They tell us almost nothing about Chaucer the poet, who seemed to be moonlighting, writing this poetry that was going to become, in many ways, sort of the center or the foundation of much later English literature. So among the things that Chaucer did well, of course, poetry, apparently working in the government. Among those things he did well was he married very well. His wife, Philippa, she was formerly also a servant in the house of the Countess of Ulster. We presume that they met there as teenagers, and she later entered the service of the Queen of Edward III. And so eventually this marriage almost certainly put Chaucer into the orbit of this man, the John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, who was a very pivotal person in 14th century English politics. And he was the son of a king, Edward III. He was the uncle to the king, Richard II, and father of the king, Henry IV. It turns out by later in Chaucer's life, he ends up being the brother-in-law of Chaucer also. And that's because Catherine Swynford, who's the sister of Chaucer's wife, was the mistress of John of Gaunt. And eventually, after John of Gaunt's second wife died, they were married, and they had at least 4 children together. So this puts Chaucer, middle-class son of a wine merchant, by the end of his life, very in the highest echelons of English society. You know, he's directly working for kings and surely knew the individuals who lived at the very highest reaches of English society. Now, I've given you some mileposts to think about that you yourself might want to introduce in the classroom or that you're likely to encounter. Let's talk a little bit about how we might handle this in teaching. Or, well, of course, one way to do it is simply give the kind of introduction I just gave and then jump straight into the literature. That's perfectly fine. There are also ways we might think about digging into the biography a little bit more alongside the literature. Now, there's a certain temptation to see in these biographical details that I've mentioned a cause and effect with the literature. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, it's often been observed that if you think about the Canterbury Tales, we see this very wide spectrum of society. You know, folks that are not the very highest echelons of society, but folks who are fairly highly placed, such as the monk, the prioress, the knight, and then down to fairly common workers, the plowman, the cook, folks like that, and a vast array of merchants and attorneys and doctors and everything else in between. So there's a temptation to say, well, Chaucer's social mobility and the many different people he would have encountered during his career, being a soldier, a diplomat, a controller of the ports, overseer of construction projects, he had done all these things. He would have interacted with merchants, builders, politicians, lawyers, nobility, soldiers, kings, commoners, you name it. Chaucer must have had dealings with them. And so he would have had this very exposure to a very wide array of characters who might serve then as models for some of his literary characters. There's a similar thing in terms of his own social mobility. So Chaucer is the grandson of a shoemaker, the son of a wine merchant, as I mentioned. He himself becomes a member of Parliament. His son Thomas rose to be Speaker of the House of Commons, and his grandfather, by marriage, became a duchess. So we see this social mobility of Chaucer, and again, there's the temptation to see this in his works. So particularly in these texts, such as the Wife of Bass Tale, where we see this emphasis on true nobility lying in the actions of a person, not in their birth. Now, I would say as long as we're not overconfident in drawing too much of a direct connection, like to really assert, hey, there's definitely this cause and effect, that the image that we're able to sketch of Chaucer, the man in the historical record, and the characters created by him, indeed, thinking about Chaucer's biography can be both instructive and entertaining. And indeed, it feels like sort of a luxury given the fact that we know so little about almost every other writer from the time. And I think it's actually a great example of introducing, whether directly or indirectly, the sorts of evidence that we tend to work with in the humanities and the sorts of thinking that we can do with those. Right? We're not really proving here that there's a connection. We're entertaining what biography might mean for literary output and vice versa. And there's a limit to how certainly we can claim these things, but certainly we do get an illumination of the literature by considering these things. Now, sorry, I meant to go to this slide earlier. This is simply John of Gaunt's family tree. So you can just see him descended here from Edward III, and the kingship jumps a generation to Edward III's grandson, Richard. He's deposed, and then John of Gaunt's son takes over. Okay, so I have here two sources for those of you who are really interested in digging deeper into Chaucer's life. There's, in one sense, the kind of heavy duty and harder to get is Chaucer's life records, which is the collaborative work of four scholars really working over decades. This was published in 1966 by the University of Texas Press. And if you really want to do a deep dive and you can get your hands on this book, this is the one that has those roughly 500 documents. There are a few things that have been turned up since then, but the bulk of them are here. Now, a much more accessible way is the Harvard's Geoffrey Chaucer website, which in the packet of information I gave, I'd asked you to do some reading from there. I'm going to talk about this site several times tonight. It's terrific because it has a lot of reliable resources and it's freely available. So this is something that's less of a deep dive, lower barrier for you and for your students to access if you'd like to. Okay, I'm going to move from Chaucer, the person, the biography, next to talking about the century in which he lived, as some sort of background. Mike, do you think this might be a moment to pause for questions?
All right, good deal. Thank you for that. And I will encourage everyone who's in attendance, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. During my earlier announcement, I mentioned that we will be including them there. So if you include them in the audience chat, I'll go through and take a look at them. But please feel free to enter any questions that you may have in the Q&A chat. I think we're fine for now, Tim. I'll circle back with them, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you so much.
All right, sounds good. So we will. I'm going to talk now about some of the difficulties in the 14th century, and then before we jump into the Canterbury Tales itself, we can pause again to talk about that. Okay, so as you probably know, life in the medieval era could always be somewhat dicey, right? You had disease, war, famine, political turmoil posing significant threats to much of the population of Europe over a period of many centuries. Indeed, I think that it's not only that this is known, it's probably overemphasized, where people talk about the terrible dark ages and that sort of thing. And of course, there are many time periods, both before and after the Middle Ages, in many places in the world where these sorts of forces of disease, war, famine, political turmoil have caused very similar problems. Even so, Chaucer's world, 14th century England, I think is, by most any account, an especially turbulent time, certainly in the history of England. And that's because we had these four forces all appearing, in many cases reappearing throughout the century, and interacting with one another in fairly devastating ways, particularly for folks further down the socioeconomic chain. So I'm going to talk about the four of them, that is famine, war, the plague, and social unease in the form of peasants' revolt. And don't worry, things will get more cheerful later on. But this is sort of a very important background information for understanding Chaucer. Even more remarkable, I find, after thinking about these things, how cheerful and humorous Chaucer always sort of infallibly seems in his works. So the first of these, sorry, I keep being one slide behind. I meant to be on this slide, but that's just a placeholder anyway. So the first of these issues is famine. Of course, hunger is always a threat in agrarian societies where there are all sorts of things. If you get too much rain, if you get not enough rain, there were numerous epidemic die-offs of livestock in medieval England. This is essentially like plagues or pandemics that affect livestock. During wars, raids, or insurrection, land, livestock provisions could be stolen or destroyed. In fact, they were very often directly targeted as ways to weaken these countries. And so this is always a threat in medieval Europe and medieval England, and really in any agrarian society. Even during relatively good years, there were always lean months. You're waiting for the next harvest to come in. These were called the hungry months. They even had a name for the phenomenon. And, we're talking about a time without any, well, obviously without refrigeration, but without any real great way to store food for significant periods of time. So food spoilage and importing food are both problematic. And so folks are living, for the most part, year to year, and one bad year can have really disastrous effects on significant portions of the population. The most devastating of these in England was probably just a couple of decades before Chaucer was born, the Great Famine of 1315 to 17. In that case, it was too much rain that happened, and much of the cropland of England was flooded. Some areas, as much as 15% of the population starved to death. But during Chaucer's lifetime, there were other significant periods of hunger. So particularly bad years in 1321, 1351, 1369, just to name a few. And of course, as happens, these problems almost always have a domino effect. So wet weather and malnourishment will then contribute to widespread death through diseases like pneumonia. So this was going on repeatedly throughout Chaucer's lifetime. And again, the 14th century had many, many bad weather years that contributed to this. And this is important because when we're reading Chaucer and reading other medieval literature, and food comes up quite often, and it's important to think about the different meaning food might have had, or food insecurity might have had at that time. So for example, when we look at the prioress, when we'll talk about in detail in a little while, feeding really fine bread to her dogs, that sits very differently in a time when people are starving to death than it does today, where it seems just kind of a strange, maybe even charming detail, right? Or where you see other characters who overindulge in food. This is seen as, in our day, the problem is kind of avoiding that. This is exactly the season, right, where we're all swearing once again not to overindulge in food after having done so for the past 6 weeks. It's a very different sort of valence to it, a very different sort of tone to it when you count this in the Middle Ages. So that's something to be sensitive to and to look for. What are the sort of moral aspects of food and eating that we see in these characters? I've already mentioned the 100 Years' War. I mentioned Chaucer. Young Chaucer was a soldier in the 100 Years' War, and he was captured and ransomed back. Now, if you've had a history class, you've probably heard the well-worn joke by now about the Holy Roman Empire, right? Which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And we might adapt that a bit for the Hundred Years' War, which is really not one war, and it didn't last 100 years. It lasted over 100 years. But this is, as happens, this is the thing we're stuck with, the name we're stuck with. But for all of Chaucer's lifetime, England was at war with France, and this stemmed from the Norman invasion of 1066, when the Normans from the region of Normandy in France conquer England in 1066. There's a 300-year period that follows that encompasses, again, all of Chaucer's life, where the entire court of the king is French-speaking, everyone around him is French-speaking, many of the nobles are French-speaking, they're from the Norman lineage. And there's actually quite a very active literary culture of people writing in French in England. This, we call this Anglo-Norman, this type of French. So this has implications both for the language, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on, but also culturally, because what's happened since the French king conquered England 300 years before, his descendants are kings in England. Then France also has kings. There's a lot of disputes over which portions of France belong by right of inheritance to the English kings. And so this is a back and forth war that goes on really from 1337 to 1453. So again, all of Chaucer's lifetime, there's significant military activity going on with France. There are periods of time where there are truces or there are lulls in the fighting, or both countries are just too busy, as with dealing with the plague, and war stops for a while, but it never really dies down. And so one other important aspect of this is that it meant that the king was repeatedly levying and raising taxes on the population of England to try to fund this. Okay, so we're going to talk in a moment about how all these things come together. So keep in mind, hunger, warfare for the whole century, and then famously the bubonic plague, also called the Black Death. This was a devastating pandemic that occurred all across Europe from 1346 to 1353. And again, as with the Great Famine, there were actually more than one plague, and there was more than one even incidents of bubonic plague popping up. But this was kind of the big one that did the most damage. Appearing at first in 1346 in Europe, it reaches England in 1348, and within a year it had engulfed the entire nation. And both the transmission of the disease and death from it were quite rapid. Usually people died within 7 days, sometimes as fast as 2 days. So it was very fast moving and fast acting. And the victims would develop these tumors on their bodies, particularly in their groins and armpits, that soon grew discolored. And so this is why it's called the Black Death. And it's hard to calculate an accurate number of deaths from this looking at medieval sources. Most historians today would say on the low side, at least 40% of England died. It's perhaps as much as 60% of the population died from this pandemic. So you can imagine all of us today sitting here, or wherever we are in the US, wherever you are in the world, we've just lived through a pandemic, right? And which killed about 1% of the people who were infected with it. And you can recall, I'm sure, the fear, the devastation, the knowledge of people who were lost from that. And to think that, something that killed up to 60% of the entire country, and for which no one had any knowledge of what it was. I mean, there's no knowledge of microorganisms and so forth. This, combined with the war, with the weather phenomena and everything, had many people believing not that they lived in the Middle Ages, but that they lived in end times. They often refer to it this way. So again, back to the literature, thinking about this, when we encounter characters in the Canterbury Tales, such as the pardoner, who offers false hope of miracle cures, he's carrying around a bunch of bogus relics, we might think, oh, that's an unsavory character. But you can imagine the desperation for any sort of solution, especially in a highly religious society, absent of any kind of medical understanding of the plague and its transmission. Also, the pilgrims themselves were told right at the beginning that they're all headed to Canterbury Cathedral. And one thing that Canterbury Cathedral was particularly famous for, different cathedrals had different saints associated with them. And the Canterbury Cathedral is famous for the holy water there purportedly healing disease. This is something Chaucer mentions in the first few lines of the poem. So it's useful to remember this tragic background of the plague and the desperation that the average person must have felt when we're thinking about this literature. And finally, I want to mention the peasants' revolt. Now, in this case, what I really want to, the idea I really want to convey to you is that there was a tremendous amount of social unease, and there was a lot of nascent social mobility that hadn't really been there before. And the peasants' revolt, I think, is the best illustration of that. But the revolt itself isn't really the big idea so much as all this sort of churning of society is happening that led to this sort of outbreak. So you think about all the above: the war, the heavy burden of taxation went with the war, hunger, destitution, illness. Necessarily, all of these things collide with one another, right? And they compound the misery of the common person. They don't happen one and then the other in sort of isolated silos. And there was another side effect of this, which isn't. It's one of those things that's like clear once I say it, but it's not the first thing you would think about, which is that these events really drastically increase the value of labor. If you're able-bodied, alive, you're not dead from one of the things I just mentioned, you're super valuable, right? There's not many folks like that left. And there just aren't many healthy people left for the work to be done. So this means all of a sudden that folks who were in a hereditary way, just working the same plot of land that generations of their families had worked, are now more socially mobile, finding that they have a value that they can negotiate and so forth. We also have this emergent merchant class that Chaucer himself emerges from, and you can see the kind of upward mobility of these classes that formerly were commoners. Well, they're still commoners, but that formerly had little social power or wealth. And all of this is creating is really upsetting the apple cart in terms of social hierarchy, right? So in 1381, this kind of burst out in a huge way. We don't have exact numbers, but at least 60,000 people were involved in this uprising in one form or another, and it's called the Peasants' Revolt. But not all of them were peasants. There were artisans, there were some lower-ranking soldiers, even some lower-ranking priests who participated in one form or another. And there was a huge mob of people who descended on London, and along the way they destroyed a lot of property associated with the king. They even captured the Tower of London, and they executed a number of notable people, including an archbishop. The king was able to put this down fairly quickly with some troops he hastily got together, but nonetheless, it's emblematic of this serious unrest that's happening. So again, when we return to the literature and we think about this, there's a lot of class consciousness that happens, say, in the Canterbury Tales. So these moments, such as when the knight tells his story, the host has the idea that each pilgrim is going to tell a story in a proper order, going down by social significance, and right away the drunken miller jumps out of line and says he's not going to wait for any better man to tell a story. He's going to tell his story, right? So we see this kind of upending of class that happens there. That again, we understand better when we're sensitive to all this turmoil happening under the hood. Okay, so how to handle this in the classroom? I think there are a couple of ways. One is that these work well as if you're looking at Chaucer's biography, you can sort of weave these in and out of your discussions of the literature. It also works well to have kind of either in-class assignments or even take-home assignments where students work on particular aspects either of Chaucer's biography or of the 14th century itself. So, okay, Chaucer was a soldier captured in battle in the Hundred Years' War. What's the Hundred Years' War, right? That's a good sort of assignment to give someone, and it's a way into the history talking about Chaucer's biography. How might this be reflected, say, in the night, right, and so forth. So you can do standalone assignments in that way, that even splitting these things up among your students, and collectively it gives them, I think, some sort of traction, right, where they're thinking about how history interacts with literature, biography, what are the limitations or affordances of biography when thinking about a poet, and so forth. I did want to close on a little bit, not the talk, but this section on a little bit of a happier note, which is that as so often happens during all this upheaval, it wasn't bad in a totally unmitigated way, because as so often happens in what seems paradoxical, but it happens so often, it's surely not. These terrible times produced really great art, and some of the finest English literature ever written came during the latter part of this 14th century. There was an enormous flowering. This is often called the Ricardian period, because this is during the reign of Richard II. We see him in the illustration here, receiving a book from its author, and he was very much a patron of the arts and of literature, and his reign by most measures was very unsuccessful. You may be familiar with Richard II from Shakespeare's unflattering and, for the most part, not very accurate depiction of him, but pretty much all the evidence suggests he wasn't all that great as a king. He was something of an autocrat, and there were these continual power struggles with the nobility trying to limit his power. And there's fairly widespread agreement, both in his own day and by historians now, that he really did not handle all the crises we just talked about very well. And he acted in ways that tended to exacerbate them. Nonetheless, there was this incredible literary flourishing during his reign, the Ricardian period. So Chaucer was writing. This was when he wrote almost all of his works. Chaucer's friend Gower is another famous poet from the time. William Langland wrote Piers Plowman, another masterpiece. The Gawain poets working at the same time, writing Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and so forth. So, so against this backdrop of all these crises, we do experience this remarkable period of literature, from which Chaucer is the most famous poet. Okay, Mike, I'll pause again there. The next topic's really Chaucer's language and English language during his time. I don't know if there are any questions that we need to address, or if you want me to keep rolling.
Good deal. Thank you for pausing for questions. We have a question that stemmed from your discussion of the famines, and the question is I guess I should say, how was Chaucer affected personally by these famines? So the question is, was Chaucer affected personally by these famines? And I guess I would extend the question from the attendee to include, how did that appear throughout his writings? You mentioned it a little bit, but what insight into his personality can we gain from how he dealt with this sense of misery and desperation?
Yeah, so I'll take those two different questions, one about insight into his personality, the other about how he was personally impacted. There isn't any evidence that I know of that would suggest that he had any, he himself was kind of a victim of hunger or experienced it in that way. What he really looks like professionally is, the kind of guy who gets one promotion after another, right? His career just seems to take off, and he seems successful at navigating what were some very different political moments and tensions between kings, and he just seems to ascend, throughout his career. So he, again, by the end, he is very, very highly placed in terms of his social circles. And as always happens when we talk about these problems in society, whether it's pandemics or hunger or war, the the common person suffers more almost always than the elite, and that's a depressing reality that we still have, right? Who's on the front lines? This is true even with the plague, because um, the folks with more money could go off in their country house and live in isolation until it passes over. So there's not any evidence that I can think of that would show Chaucer being personally directly affected by hunger, and the evidence we have, I think, points the other direction. Now, like Chaucer's personality, I think that's actually an impossible link to make. You could speculate some, but what we have are these documents that don't paint a picture of a personality, but rather are documenting moments in a career of a civil servant. And then we have his literature. So then the question is, what can the literature tell us about the person? And there we have to be very careful, I think. Chaucer, so it's kind of like literature 101. You don't assume that the poet is like the people in his work, right? So we don't assume that Stephen King is an axe murderer, right? Just because he writes these people or writes from the point of view or writes about them. This has to be the case with Chaucer because his characters are so diverse. However, Chaucer, as always, frustrates that easy response because he keeps putting a narrator in his stories named Chaucer, right? Who has some of his biographical details. So we're kind of there's kind of the lure to say, oh, aha, this will give us something about Chaucer. But in most cases, this narrator is kind of a dunce. He's always inept at love, inept at poetry, doesn't really understand what he's doing as a narrator and so forth. Whereas here we are reading a masterpiece written by this poet named Chaucer. So it's kind of a comical version of himself he puts in there. So I think it's hard to know. I think on the one hand that we have these documents that document a career, not a personality. On the other, we start to feel like we have a sense of Chaucer, the person, but we always have to be on guard because he's kind of conspicuously, and I always feel like in a sort of mischievous way, manipulating that. So I do think that the moments where food appears, and it appears a lot, right? We have the miller stealing grain. We have the merchant whose table's always piled high with food, always set out and full of food. We have a professional cook there, and so forth. We have a monk who eats too much, right? Who loves hunting and all that. And so, so I think in those moments that when we need to think about this background that Chaucer, even if he wasn't suffering from, he was seeing the suffering almost for sure, right? So I think that's where we could probably gain the most traction.
Thank you so much. Love that response. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Appreciate it. We are a little bit before 8 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and move ahead. We have maybe one or two other questions that I'll bring to your attention a little bit later. Thanks, Tim.
Okay, thanks. So I want to move on now to talking about the English language, Chaucer's English. Now, it may come as a surprise to many of you, and almost certainly will come as a surprise to most of your students, that one very remarkable thing about Chaucer's poetry is that it's in English. Okay, so some of you are probably saying, now wait a minute. Of course it's in English. I mean, father of English poetry and all that, right? But the key here to think about is what I mentioned earlier, is that following the Norman conquest, there was a more than 300-year period when the everyday language of the court, by which I'm talking about the court of the king, not the law courts, the everyday language was French at the highest echelons. Indeed, Henry IV, whom I mentioned earlier, was crowned in 1399, was the first English king since 1066 whose mother tongue was English rather than French. So we have 300 years of the king speaking French, the French poetry being written, French being the elite language. Now, of course, during this time period, there is English poetry being written, and English remained the first and often the only language of the majority of the population in England. However, much of the literary culture was centered in or influenced by court life. And so we have this somewhat odd situation that in England during this time period, English itself is not a prestige language or the language of choice for many of the poets in England itself. So, in many ways, what Chaucer's doing is showing for the first time to the taste of many or the satisfaction of many that English is just as good as of a literary language as, say, French is, right? So there's several important ramifications for this, for thinking about Chaucer's poetry. First, keep in mind that the everyday world that Chaucer's moving around in is trilingual. So in addition to English and French, Latin is the language of education. If you go to college, all the lectures are in Latin, all the texts are in Latin. If you go to church, the mass is in Latin. It's also the language of the professions, science, medicine, law, theology. And it remains in Chaucer's time actually an active literary language. So Chaucer's friend Gower, whom I mentioned a moment ago, composed poetry in all three languages. He composed major poems in all three languages. Indeed, he didn't move to English until late in his life. It's also clear that Chaucer was a very avid reader in all three languages. He was, because he's adapting source text and literary forms from them. Remarkably, he was also working from Italian. He's reading Boccaccio and Dante, for example. That's remarkable because almost no one in Chaucer's time period in England knew Italian other than him. Keep in mind, he was a diplomat there. So even though Chaucer apparently only composed in English, he was always working with these other languages. And you will see in his poetry that his English works are really peppered all the way through with terms borrowed directly from French and Latin. Another important aspect of the linguistic environment at this time is that the English language was really rapidly shifting. So from the time of the Norman conquest, there was a huge change in the language from its Germanic origins. If you look, I saw a question go by a minute ago about Old English. Chaucer's language is Middle English, not Old English. Old English would be like the original language of Beowulf. And from about the year 1100 to 1500, we're in a period called Middle English, which is Chaucer's period. And there's a drastic difference between those languages. Old English was a Germanic language. It came from the Anglo-Saxon settlers of England from areas like Denmark and Scandinavia, Germany. And it had Germanic origins. And after 1066, we get a lot of loan words from French, but also English as a language started to change the way it works grammatically to work in a way closer to French. If any of you have studied German or Latin, you'll know we don't really have time to go into the nuts and bolts of this, but it's what we call a fully declined language. That is, the word stem changes spelling based on its function in the sentence. If it's the subject of a sentence, it's spelled one way. If it's the object of the verb, another way. The indirect object, another way. Whereas in French, we use a lot of prepositions and use word order to govern this. So if you say Chaucer bit the dog, it doesn't mean the same thing as the dog bit Chaucer, right? Swapping order swaps meaning. So English undergoes a tremendous change. It's highly mobile during this time, and you often see, I think, in moments of rapid change in language, a lot of artistic freedom and capacity. I think we're seeing this right now. If you look at, say, the English language in hip hop, right? You're seeing this kind of very playful, intentional working with the language and sort of subverting the expectations and that sort of thing. And so Chaucer lived at a time of this very rapid change. And he himself was a key player in English gaining prestige as a literary language. So the politics of the 100 Years' War really played into this, right? Because he's alive at a moment where England is fighting against France, and there is, for the first time, not like, hey, we're these Norman folks who own both France and England, but rather increasingly we are English, right? This idea of a national identity that's not only distinct from France, but is very often in opposition to France, right? So this is a perfect moment for English to come forward as a prestige language. So Chaucer had the good fortune to speak this dialect of English that would become the standard, that is the London dialect. He had the good fortune to be working in a time when the language is rapidly changing, so there's a lot of capacity for innovation. And at a moment when the English nation, including the king and the court, were increasingly seeking to establish this English identity, right? So I like to call this kind of the Elvis Presley moment, right? Sure, this guy has loads of talent, but man, was this guy in the right place at the right time? You know, he really was there to be the guy to make English poetry happen. That doesn't take anything away from his talent or his cleverness and thoughtfulness about choosing to do this, but he just really was the right guy at the right time to do this. And there's one other idea I want to convey very, very rapidly here, keeping an eye on the clock, which is this idea of dialect. That you know, if we had a guest speaker suddenly pop on here, one person from Scotland, one from New Zealand, one from Jamaica, and they all said a couple sentences, you all would be able to tell me which one was which right away. But if they all wrote the same sentences, they would be identical, right? And that's because our spelling is standardized, but our dialects are not, right? In terms of how we pronounce words, even vocabulary and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of poetry happening in Chaucer's time that are in dialects that remain very difficult for us. So if you look at this slide here, I have a Sir Gawain the Green Knight, the original on the left, the translation on the right. This Hazel held us him in the hall interest, driven to the Hea Deus. Duty no wotha, held it he never owna, but Hea he overlook it, right? That's English, but you're saying, what on earth does it mean, right? You almost have to read that in translation. And that's because this poet, who's a direct contemporary of Chaucer, the Gawain poet, this is a passage from Gawain the Green Knight, is from the north and west of the country, and this is typical of dialect there. Chaucer, however, looking at a little section here from the general prologue, is speaking this London dialect, and when you read this, there will be certain words you need to look up, you need gloss, but you'll see right away you can get a lot of the words. One that April with his sure suta, the draught of March has pierced to the ruta, invaded every vein and switched liqueur, which vertu engendered is the fluor, right? Even if what he's saying is complex, you see that you recognize most of the words, and with not too much work, you start to see how shura is shower and pierced means pierced and so forth, right? And so Chaucer's, in this kind of interesting chicken and egg way, there's a way in which his poetry being in this dialect that for a variety of socio-political reasons became the standard modern English. That served him well, but then also I think he has a hand in that, you know. So this is a fascinating thing about him. Now, one thing to consider when you're teaching is whether to teach in translation or whether to teach the original Middle English. And there are a lot of moments when this decision, our hands are tied, or this decision is made for us. If we have an assigned textbook or something like that. So I would like to just make a pitch for at least introducing Chaucer's Middle English in some way, even if it's just a small section of lines with a translation assignment. I asked you all to read the general prologue using this Harvard's website again, and that has an interlinear translation, so you can see the original with the translation line by line. Now, of course, the trick here is human nature, not only for our students but us. You know, you're running against the clock. You need to read this thing. It's human nature for your eyes to drift towards the easier ones. So that's kind of the downside. But this is something where easily available, free online. There are translations, and I offered some suggestions for books on the final slide, but also in your reading packet. If you want to tackle the the original Middle English, the Norton Chaucer, I think is a good textbook to go. And this probably depends on whether you're a K-12 educator or you're in higher ed, right? What your options are here. So we're going to talk about the Canterbury Tales to wrap things up here. I did want to mention very briefly, though, Chaucer's major works beyond this. Chaucer wrote, so I've listed here 6 of his major works. 4 of these actually are in this dream vision genre, including all the poems he wrote that we have from his younger years. Now, he did write a number of other poems. He wrote some short poetry, some lyric poetry. He did a couple of translations of text. He actually wrote a treatise on the astrolabe. He was very fascinated with astronomy. And so early in his career, he was a dream vision poet. So the dream vision is a very popular medieval genre where the narrator falls asleep and then wakes up in this dream world and usually has some sort of fabulous, often allegorical experience, frequently with the aid of a guide. And some of the most famous and in their own day and today works of medieval literature are in this genre. The Roman de la Rose, or Romance de la Rose, is probably almost certainly the most popular medieval French poem, and it's popular across Europe. Chaucer himself translated portions of this into English. Piers Plowman in England, the Divine Comedy by Dante is not strictly speaking a dream vision, but is very clearly in dialogue with that tradition. Incidentally, the illustration you're looking at here from the Roman de la Rose manuscript, all those figures in blue are aspects of the dreamer who's in bed in the top left there. So in his dream world, he's getting up, getting dressed, walking out into the world, and counting the river, pondering the meaning of these allegorical figures he sees on the wall and so forth. So Chaucer in his early career was a dream vision poet. Those are not generally taught outside of the university classroom, and even there, it's basically seminars focusing on Chaucer. So I'm not really going to go into those today. His major work, and what most critics would say is his masterpiece, is not the Canterbury Tales, rather, but Troilus and Cresside. And so it's the masterpiece because it's finished. It's kind of conspicuously perfect in terms of even down to the numerology of its line count, whereas the Canterbury Tales has all these kind of unfinished bits, and it's nowhere near what Chaucer said it was going to be at the beginning, and in terms of its length. And this is a text that is set during the Trojan War, and it tells the story of Troilus, a prince of Troy, and his kind of doomed love for Cressida, and with the backdrop of Troy itself being doomed. And it really is a truly magnificent poem. It's probably the most difficult of Chaucer's poems to read, and so for that reason too, it's not a beginner poem, and it's I typically teach it only in Chaucer seminars. It's worth looking at. I've zoomed in here on the detail because this is a fascinating illustration, a very famous one from a Troilus and Cresside manuscript at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. And this is a depiction of Chaucer kind of standing in a pulpit reading this poem out to Richard II and these assembled VIPs, right? So this is another glimpse at that literary culture I was mentioning earlier. Okay, the star attraction always is the Canterbury Tales, and so it is today with our talk. I know that most of you are going to be spending the majority of your time teaching the Canterbury Tales. The same with me, right? If I'm teaching an undergraduate survey course, Survey of English Literature, a course, Canterbury Tales takes first place, right? And remarkably, for something that's so kind of central to the canon of English literature, and of course, the whole notion of canonicity is a can of worms we can't really get into, but if there is a canon, if there's such a thing, obviously Chaucer has to be there, pretty much right at the center with Shakespeare. Remarkably, it's kind of a hot mess if you think about it compared to everything else, in that it's nowhere near finished. I mean, we're told at the beginning we're going to have this storytelling competition where they're going to go to Canterbury and come back, and each pilgrim's going to tell 2 stories on the way and 2 stories coming back. Since there's 20 of them, we should have 120 tales. Maybe Chaucer had in mind, almost certainly had in mind, Boccaccio's Decameron. Boccaccio reached the finish line. He has 100 stories, right, in his storytelling frame. But we get 22 at Chaucer. Not all of them are finished. Some people never tell a story. They never reach Canterbury. So it's kind of funny in a way that it's so much a work in progress, yet it's this tremendous literary masterpiece, which it is, you know. And part of the reason for that is that it's what we call a frame narrative. A frame narrative is when you have some sort of frame on which you can sort of hang other stories. And of course, the storytelling competition is a great way to do that. That way you can have very different stories side by side as he does. In real life, there was a lot of pilgrimage. There was a lot of pilgrimage to Canterbury. In real life, however, such a group of 20 people almost certainly never would have traveled together, right? They're two kind of disparate in their social milieus, right? So Chaucer did this great thing in putting them together because in his genres, he's able to move all over the place, from sort of the high to the low, from the lofty to the scatological, right? And so he really did a clever thing by that. So again, Canterbury Tales has this general prologue which lays out the kind of rules of the game. We're going to have a storytelling competition, and then each of the tales has its own genre, right? So we're going to talk a little bit here about the general prologue, and it's great for all sorts of classroom settings, even if you have limited time, because it has all these bite-sized, what we call pilgrim portraits. The pilgrims are simply the individuals who are on pilgrimage to Canterbury, who are doing the storytelling. They're your cast of narrators, if you would. In the case of the slide here, this is from the Ellesmere manuscript at the Huntington Library, San Marino, California, maybe the most famous of Chaucer manuscripts in the world. We literally have portraits here. It looks like I put the monk, parson, miller, and partner, but that on the left is actually the knight. So I need to fix that. That's actually the knight, I think the parson, the miller, and partner. These, we also call the verbal descriptions of these pilgrim portraits, even though most of the manuscripts don't have illustrations. And the general prologue is a medieval genre that is something entirely unfamiliar today, unless you happen to study medieval poetry, which is it's what we call an estate satire. Estate, like, you know, estate sale or something. Estate means something totally different in medieval English. It means basically social status, your stature in the world, your social status. And so this is a genre that asks, is person X performing their role in society adequately? Because of course, if the person doesn't, then society falls apart. You know, if you have like the lecherous priest, or today if you have the like corrupt policeman, you know, society starts to crumble when people don't do their work. If you have lazy farmers, everyone starves. If you have weak knights, the country gets overrun, and so forth, right? And so the genre, which would have been immediately recognizable to Chaucer's audience, aha, we're in the midst of an estate satire, is asking this question: is person X doing their job properly? So we get the good, the bad, and the ugly in the general prologue. We get obviously good characters like the knight. Whether or not you think he's good, he seems efficient as a knight. The parson, who seems to be a good country parson. But then you get folks like the miller, who we're told is a cheat, who steals corn, steals money. He's a drunk. He's a brawler. He tells dirty stories and dirty jokes, and so he's problematic, right? Or this partner who we mentioned earlier, who's carrying around these false relics, and he admits to everyone that he's a fraud, and he's very eloquent in his preaching, and so he uses basically religion and these lies as a sort of means to enrich himself. So we see this whole spectrum of people um, who are, some of them are good examples of what they're supposed to be in society, some are bad. This is very typical of a state satire as a genre. I wanted to zero in with the little bit of time we have left on one character, the prioress, and that's because Chaucer is I think refreshingly, sometimes frustratingly, but always refreshingly ambiguous. That is, in many people's hands in the Middle Ages, this state satire became a vehicle to be very didactic, right? To say, oh, let me teach you a lesson about good and bad, about these roles in society and who does what, and wagging your finger at all the bad folks. Chaucer was very often sly and humorous, but also just simply ambiguous. We encounter this in virtually every one of his poems where he really leaves it open. And I think this is an important thing to bring to the attention of students, that very often we sit with this unresolved, right? This isn't something we can say, is the prioress a good or bad portrait? Yes or no. It'll be on the midterm. We really have to get comfortable with the unresolved nature of it. Let me just quickly show you what I mean here. If we look in at the description, there was also a nun, a prioress, that of her smiling was full simple and coy. Her greatest oath was but by Saint Loy, and she was clepit Madame Eglantine. Okay, so in the context of a state satire, well, a prioress is the leader of a group of nuns. She shouldn't be coy, right, which is kind of playful, this kind of pretended shyness. She shouldn't be a coquette, but she is, right? Her oath by Saint Loy, well, that's Saint Eloy in French, named for the religious patron saint of goldsmiths. Interesting, right? That's not what we expect. And we then learned all these strange details about her. Chaucer kind of like sets her up high, undermines her, sets her up high, undermines her. By the way, Madame Eglantine is a common name for a romance heroine. What's a romance heroine doing being a prioress, right? So she sings her service the divine service very well through her nose, we're told. Okay, that's kind of strange, right? She speaks French very beautifully, like they do in Stratford, right? Not the way they do in Paris, but how they do in this suburb of London, right? And so forth. We get a lot of business about her table manners here. This is kind of weird stuff for a prioress. Are we supposed to think she's good or bad? That's the name of the game with the state satire. We're not sure. Over on the second column, we see that she kind of seems to have a tender heart, but maybe it's a bit too much, right? She weeps if she sees a mouse caught in a trap. She feeds these small dogs that she has with her roasted meat, milk, or wastel bread, this kind of very fine, expensive bread. And she'll weep if any of them, get hit by someone or anything happens to them. This seems to me like, one of our kind of B-list celebrities with their chihuahuas or something, right? This, again, not really on target for what we think would be the right sort of thing for a prioress. However, what are her crimes? I mean, they're misdemeanors at the most, right? Then we get this moment that I think is meant to perhaps satirize the narrator as much as anyone else. Full seemly her wimple pinched was. So he's talking about her headdress. Her nose traitous, her eyen grey as glass, her mouth full small, thereto soft and red. But sicker, she had a fair forehead. Okay, so Chaucer, this is something that feminist critics have often done a lot of work on in medieval poetry, which is this tendency of male poets to have what we call the blazon, which starts at the head of the lady and then usually stops at the the breast or the waist, saying, "Oh well, but I better not go any further." Tee hee hee, right? The poet in his false modesty, and this is kind of, but it sort of itemizes physically the lady's virtues. And believe it or not, in a huge sex symbol in the Middle Ages was a really nice forehead. You really wanted to see that forehead up there. The bigger, the better, right? I guess Helen Hunt would have been all the rage back then. But it's kind of this is improper for a nun, right? For the narrator, basically seems to really be physically attracted to this woman, and then we learn at the end she has this little coral beads about her arms. This is where we would expect prayer beads, but instead we get this jewelry, and then she has a brooch of gold, which seems to recall the goldsmith from the third line, on which we find a letter A in written in Latin, amor vincit omnia, amor, love conquers all. Well, as it turns out, this is the wrong kind of love for a prioress to experience, because that's romantic and often sexual love. And what you would want, there's a lot of theology written about this. The what you would want is a caritas, right? This other love, this kind of love of charity, this biblical love, this absolutely chaste love. So what we seem to have here is a prioress who isn't that great of a prioress. She seems to really want to be a romance heroine. She has a romance heroine name, and we learn over at the bottom of the first column on the left, she was full, pleasant, and amiable of port. So she was very pleasant and very amiable in her disposition. She painted her to counterfeit to chair of court. So she takes great pains. And notice this emphasis on seeming rather than being, of social appearance rather than substance, which is inappropriate for the prioress. She takes pains to counterfeit the manners of court, to be estaatlich, an important word in an estate satire, to be very kind of stately in her manner, and to beholden, that means to be considered worthy of reverence, not to be reverent, not to be pious, not to be devout, but to counterfeit the mannerisms of court society and to be held worthy of their reverence, right? So what do we have here is a lot of ambiguity, and so we do get portraits like the ones that precede this. The knight seems to be a really solid knight, a great fighter, a no nonsense kind of guy. His son is a squire. He's got all the usual teen stuff, stars in his eyes. He's interested in ladies and learning how to be a knight. The yeoman seems to be a very solid kind of foot soldier sort of guy, servant to the knight. And then suddenly Chaucer hits us with this, the fourth portrait, and it's very hard to know what to do with it because it's absolutely ambiguous. This is not a brutal takedown of her necessarily as a bad person, but it is it's clear she's kind of not very appropriate, and nor is the gaze of the narrator at her all that appropriate, right? Okay, so I mentioned earlier that the final two slides were kind of there as us able to chop them off if we wanted to, because the teaching genre slide, I've had you already read that. I just want to call attention to the fact that there's this volume about teaching from the Canterbury Tales, and I gave you the piece I wrote, but there's a lot of things in there. And then I also wanted to that talks about teaching genre, and to call attention to, once again, the Harvard website, which has some of these genres defined, and that's a very important aspect to cover. And then these resources, at the top I give you 3 websites, and I could give you a lot more, but there's not much of a need to, because that Chaucer meta page and also the Harvard website themselves have lots and lots of links to websites, some of these specifically for teaching. And then this open access companion to the Canterbury Tales is sort of a free online version of that Oxford guide that I have listed there below. And then for those of you who really want to do a deep dive or have access to these from your library, I put their the Norton Chaucer and Riverside Chaucer are editions of Chaucer, and then the other two are kind of approaches to thinking about and teaching. And those, again, there's so much out there, but if you just follow these sites and their links, these books and their bibliographies, just these sites and books here will give you everything you need. But there's a whole world that will open up to you from those. So, Mike, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. I kind of, the closer we got to the end, I think the faster I talked to make sure we made it to the finish line. So, sorry if I had to sprint there a bit.
No, it was perfectly fine. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate it. And now, what I'll do is I'll leave the resources page up for all of the attendees. If you want to go ahead and get those in your notes now, screenshot it. I included the chaucermetapage.org in the chat. So if you all want to take a look at that, go ahead. There was a question that we had from Lori, actually from earlier, about the priorist tale and certain criticisms that are associated with it. But the question is can you address Chaucer and this sense of anti-Semitism, particularly in the priorist's tale, or any criticisms of it? Yes, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so just very briefly, for those of you who probably a lot of you aren't familiar with the priorist's tale, one of the things that's sort of shocking is that this lady who seems, if anything, kind of a little bit, a little bit too sensitive, like she's crying about the dead mouse or anything happening to her little dogs, tells a truly vicious anti-Semitic tale, which she tells her tale. And this is a story about a young Christian boy who wanders through the Jewish part of town, and the Jews hear him singing a hymn to the Virgin Mary, and they slit his throat and throw him in a latrine. So you're just like, whoa, right? Where did that come from? And this is Chaucer adapting a well-known story of this boy, Hugh of Lincoln. A lot of these were around. So I actually do quite a lot of work on medieval anti-Semitism. In fact, Mike, you probably know this. This is one of the main things I was working on during my fellowship at the National Humanities Center. It's about the default position of anyone in medieval England at this time is that they were just almost uniformly anti-Semitic. What tends to vary is the level of viciousness. With Chaucer, it's always hard to know how much any of this reflects him personally. There's not much I can point to in his literature that would say, because he wrote this poem, it's clear that he was anti-Semitic. What are we supposed to do with this priorist telling this story? To Chaucer, does that seem unremarkable? Does it reflect? Are we meant to think that it reflects poorly on the priorist? There's no real way to connect it back to Chaucer himself. So that's kind of an open puzzle to talk about. But we have to look at it in the context of that sort of anti-Semitic story is just every day in the Middle Ages, with practically zero pushback from anybody against it. It's also worth noting that fairly unique for Europe, England in 1290 there was what was called the Edict of Expulsion, and England had expelled all the Jews from England, any who weren't already killed from some violence leading up to that. And so there were no Jews living openly in England at any point during Chaucer's lifetime. So Chaucer probably, unlike many people in England, almost certainly had firsthand experience with Jews because of his travels to the continents. But there's not much of any kind of record indicating any anti-Semitic or certainly not pro-Jewish position from Chaucer, right? We just have this kind of one anti-Semitic story dropped by the priorists without any really clear way to connect that back to Chaucer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I believe that is our time, everyone. And again, Tim, just thank you. Thank you for all that you're doing over at NC State in our community. The work at the National Humanities Center, as I said it earlier, we consider you a friend. And on behalf of, my team and the entire NAC, we appreciate how you guided us in developing that deeper knowledge of Chaucer, his poetry, and giving us examples and approaches for teaching his poetry. Thank everyone who's here tonight for your time, spending your evening with us. This the first webinar of the 2024 year. We appreciate you all, as I've said numerous times before. And I'd invite you all again to check out and keep up with everything that's going on at the National Humanities Center at nationalhumanitiescenter.org. I don't know that I need to say www, but anyway, check us out at nationalhumanitiescenter.org and on our various social media channels. Also, if you are so inclined, support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. And by way of announcement, our next webinar will be held on January 25th at 7 p.m. And our guest presenter is Michael Tremblay, who is PhD, independent scholar out of Canada. And his session is entitled Focus on What is Up to You, the Stoics, on How to Be Happier, Develop Your Character, and Live a Good Life. Again, same time, 7 o'clock p.m., 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Thank you all for, again, joining us. I wish you all the best year ever. And again, if I can ever be of any assistance to you all, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or reach out to us at NHC_ed at nationalhumanitiescenter.org. Hope you all have a great weekend. Take care